Hello and welcome back to the Indian Wisdom Podcast. I'm Dr. Raj Balkaran, founder of the Indian Wisdom School, and today we'll hear a story from the Upanishads, from the Chandogya Upanishad. It's one of the two earliest Upanishads, to the best of our knowledge, circa 8th century BCE. There is a fascinating story about this great teacher, Uddālaka Aruni, and his son Śvetaketu. So his son turns 12 years old, and as in many, many cultures, 12 years old-ish is marks a rite of passage in the course of a human life. It's approximately maturation, puberty. It's sort of parallel to confirmation in some traditions, to bar mitzvah, to bat mitzvah. So he's 12 years old, right? And so his father says, look, you got to go off and study because we are Brahmanas. And Brahmanas are wielders of knowledge. We hold knowledge. And we're not Brahmanas in name only. This is really insightful. It's fascinating because even some 2 to 3 millennia ago, there were those who were functioning within their caste by birth alone, and those who were functioning within the caste by accomplishing the needful duties according to that caste. So we're Brahmanas. We're not just Brahmanas in name alone. We can't just go do IT, son. You've got to go and study. I've looked around. I found this great package. You're 12 now, so we can do junior high school, and your bachelor's all in one. 12 years of study from 12 to 24. So he says, look, you've got to go off for 12 years and study. We'll set you up with this great Ivy League program. And so young Śvetaketu was off. And some 12 years later, he returns, says the Upanishad, in sort of a haughty disposition, sort of arrogant, full of himself. He's so well trained, He got an Ivy League education, and he was quite pleased with himself and all that he had learned. And his father was a great teacher, not just his father, but a wielder of wisdom. And there are many ways to teach, and there are those who excel at mastering a body of knowledge. And that is nothing to scoff at. That's extremely important to understand a system or a body of knowledge inside out. And yet, in terms of wisdom teaching, that is the first rung. Wisdom has to do with the transmission of knowledge. And the transmission of knowledge requires not just the amassing of the seeds and the planting of the seeds, but the tilling of the soil of the consciousness of the student, of the son, etc., etc., etc. And so wise teachers not only share information, but they will ask provocative questions, or they will engage in intriguing activities so as to tweak the consciousness of the student. So it's more of an apprenticeship than a course, so to speak. And so seeing his son returning so well educated and so haughty, this is utterly fascinating. We really have this misguided sense that the ancients were so different than we are, but they were not. In every epoch of human history, one imagines there were those who were great with their hands, they were pragmatists, they were intellectuals, those great with ideas, those great with artistry, those gifted in spirituality, perhaps. And even at this phase, right, 3 millennia ago, ish, at least 2.5, we have the sense of, well, there's knowledge in a traditional sense, even in the Indic context. And then there's knowledge in an experiential sense. There's a deeper, a higher octave of knowing, right? And the fact that English has this singular word for knowledge is problematic. There are other languages that have multiple words for knowledge because there are multiple types of knowledge. For example, in the French language, there's a distinction between connaître, knowledge in terms of information, and savoir, I know, knowledge in terms of familiarity, right? And so, what sort of knowledge do we mean? Well, we don't mean the kind of knowledge that fits in your brain because Shwetaketu's brain is quite knowledgeable and his head swelled because of the knowledge therein. But the wise Uddālaka, you know, pacifies him in some sense. Oh, lovely, it's great. You've learned clearly that package we got really paid off. These 12 years of study, you've learned so much. But he says, look, have you learned that knowledge by which the unheard becomes heard, the unthought, the unconceived becomes thought, becomes known? Have you learned that knowledge? And Shvetaketu was like, what, huh? What are you talking about, Dad? You know, he says, have you learned that knowledge? Have you learned that sort of that concept of variously described as substitution or transference? Great scholar Patrick Olivelle, who's translated the Chandogya, pretty much all of the Upanishads, calls it the rule of substitution. Have you learned this rule of substitution? And he goes, well, I haven't skipped many classes, if any, and I didn't really join a dorm or anything. And I thought I was there for all of the important stuff, and I aced my test, but I don't know what you're talking about, Papa. And Papa, i.e., Uddālaka Aruni, says, look, when you have something made of clay, as many things as you have made of clay, they can all be known by clay itself. By just one lump of clay, you can perceive the essence of all things made of clay. And, he saw intrigue and perhaps a little bit of bewilderment in the eyes of his son. And so he continues. You've got to sort of read the room, You've got to gauge how things are landing, Skillful teaching takes a great deal of emotional intelligence, in addition to intellectual acumen. But, so he continues. And he says, similarly, think of all the trinkets in the world made of copper. You conceive all of the vessels and ornaments and jewelry and various accoutrements made of copper by just one bit of copper. One can understand the essence of all things made of copper. He saw the gears turning in the eyes of his son. He could smell the burning and the churning of Shvetaketu's learning. And so he continued and used the example of iron. Is it not the same with iron? Does not the essence of iron constitute all things made of iron, despite their forms? This is how this knowledge works. Shvetaketu was a little dazzled and perhaps a little bit bewildered and intrigued and inebriated and perhaps a little bit concerned. He says to his father, I suppose the illustrious professors with which I studied did not know this knowledge, else they would have taught it to us. Could you teach me this knowledge, Papa? Okay, let's do this. All right. So he's interested, right? He's interested. He's asking. This is the best type of person for whom to cook one not just with a palate, but one who hungers, one who is hungry, one in need of nourishment. And so he uses these examples as a launch pad for something much more abstract and esoteric. He's speaking about existence, about being, and he says, in the beginning, son, this world was simply what exists, existence itself, only one without a second. Now, there are some silly people, some, perhaps materialists and reductionists and, misguided physicists who say that the existent emerged from the non-existent and nothing was there before. What nonsense. How could something emerge from nothing? What existed before all this was existence itself, the one without a second. Before there was many, there was one. And even now, interpenetrating the many, abiding in the many, is the one without a second. It is that one who said, let me become many. Let me propagate myself through its own will. Right? And so he goes on and explains sort of cosmology and ontology to his highly intrigued and, perhaps slightly perturbed son, because what he's talking about is something that is not directly apprehendable by the senses. It's something that requires extraordinary speculation, intuition, beyond just mere cogitation. This is not intellectual knowledge. This is experiential knowledge. It can indeed be intellectualized, and perhaps the intellectualization of this knowledge is the first step. And yet, oftentimes, the smarter the individual intellectually, the more challenged they can be spiritually, because they're comfortable in the intellect, which excels at subject-object knowledge that emerges from the distinction between seer and seen, knowledge that has to do with the individual looking out upon the world and making sense of objects of sense. What Uddālaka Aruni is doing here is undercutting that intellectual percolation for a different sort of brew, a more innate, perhaps primal, instinctive, certainly experiential sort of knowledge. Yes, and so he goes on, but he doesn't just stay with theory. He's sort of there's a great deal of theory that he expounds, which is important about the nature of the elements and the nature of the senses and the nature of this manifestation. And there's a rich few sections that follows. But then there's a famous sort of teaching story that ensues. This all happens in chapter 6 of the Chandogya Upanishad. And this is section 12. And he says to his son, look, bring a banyan fruit. Here it is, sir, says his son, Śvetaketu. Cut it open, please. Please and thank yous are sort of implied. I've cut it open, sir. What do you see in there, Śvetaketu? Well, Papa, I see these tiny seeds, sir. Okay, take one of them out. Okay, I've taken one of them out. Okay, cut this seed, Śvetaketu. I've cut it open, sir. Okay, what do you see there? Well, nothing, sir. Nothing? The finest essence here, son. You can't even see. Look how, on account of the finest essence, this huge banyan tree stands here. The finest essence here that constitutes the self of this whole world is the truth. All that exists, what it truly exists, is this essence, which is the essence of being. The essence of the being of the banyan abides invisibly within its seed. This essence of the being of the banyan is the essence of the being of all things, of all selves. This essence is the self itself. And tat tvam asi. That you are, or such you are, or that's how you are, as Olivelle and some scholars prefer to translate this, or more famously, thou art that. Tat tvam asi. The essence that invisibly abides in this seed that manifests as the great banyan. That essence is the essence of being, the self of all selves, and you yourself are that essence. Teach me more, Papa, says Śvetaketu, intrigued. Very well, son, he says. Take this chunk of salt, Śvetaketu, and place it in a container, a vessel, a kumbha, of water, and come back to me tomorrow. Let's continue this science experiment tomorrow, shall we? The son did as he was told. And the next day they reconvened. And Uddālaka Aruni says, the salt that you put in the water last evening, bring it here. He groped around the saline solution, but could not find it, as it had dissolved completely. Is it there, or is it not there? Can you see it? Is it possible that there exists something that cannot be seen? Is it possible that what exists is beyond what can be seen? Why don't you have a little sip from this corner? Said Uddālaka, the father. How does it taste, son? Salty, said Śvetaketu. Now take a sip from the center. How does that taste, son? Salty, said Śvetaketu. Now take a sip from this corner. How does it taste, son? Salty, said Śvetaketu. Throw it out and come back later. He did as he was told and found the salt was always there. The father told him, you, of course, did not see it there, son. It was always right there. The finest essence here that constitutes the self of this whole world, that is the truth. That is the self, the Atman. And tat tvam asi, Śvetaketu. Thou art that, such you are. That's how you are. In this manner do you exist. And, of course, do we think that Śvetaketu was intrigued? He certainly was. And the teachings continued for the benefit of Śvetaketu and for the benefit of untold millions who have been informed, intrigued, and inspired by these teachings. You see, there are many levels of profundity here, not just the spiritual teachings contained in this tale, but the very pedagogical format, story, dialogue, the very manner of the transmission of the text is recorded in the text, and the notion of text itself is inapt and inept for broaching the power of lineal oral transmission. the text is but the residue of tradition. As I've said before, and I will say again, the text is on the tongue. And it is there that it lives, empowered by breath and thought and awareness. And so this little vignette into the Upanishads offers insight not only into the nature of the self, the nature of being, the essence of the universe, according to the Upanishads, but it offers insight into the very modality whereby that essence or these teachings ought to be transmitted. And it offers us insight into the notion that wielders of traditional knowledge, perhaps institutional knowledge, have always existed. And there has always existed systems of knowledge at the margins that may or may not be known or accepted by orthodoxy. And so on the one hand, Uddālaka Aruni is a great Brahmana, and he wants his son to engage in Brahmanical training, which he does. But more than just a Brahmana, by caste, he is a knower of Brahman. And he wishes to teach his son what one does not learn at university, at Guru U, at the Gurukula, necessarily. He wants to teach his son esoteric knowledge that typically is taught when one is ready, in direct tandem to one's aptitude and one's interest. And for this reason, these teachings were not always public. But now they are. And so we have those who espouse them, we have those who realize them, we have those who ridicule them, and everything in between. Which one are you? I hope that this tale has been helpful in some way. And I wish you well in this new year at the time of recording this podcast, 2025. Be well and do reach out if I may be of service. Take care. Namaste.